All right, we're going to move on. We've talked a little bit about goal setting. Now we're going to move on and talk about how to use that data, your progress monitoring data, and compare it to those goal lines to make instructional decisions for your students. In this module, this part of the module, we're going to talk more about whether, how decisions are made on whether students are responding to intervention, whether students are meeting their goals, students are making progress at an acceptable rate, and whether instruction needs to be adjusted or changed. So by the time we're done with this portion of the module, you'll have some pretty clear ideas about decision-making points that you can use to look at your data and be responsive to that data. So as I mentioned just now, we're going to use our data to answer some of these questions about how students are progressing in their programs. So we're first going to discuss instructional decision making, how to decide if students are responding to an intervention and whether we need to make an adaptation. So we're going to talk first about that. Here's an example of a graph. This graph is actually from the Dibble system. In a little while, we're going to look at just a couple of examples about how to graph data. And so whether you have data from a system or whether you're graphing your own, we want to look at that data and be responsive. So as we look at these graphs, there's some common terminology that we're going to be using to discuss and describe the goals. So one, we either call our goal line a goal, or sometimes in some systems they call it our aim line. This is the line that's developed based on the goal, the long-term goal that you set for your student. This is either set using those end of the year benchmarks, or it could be set using that weekly rate of improvement. But it starts from the baseline and then it ends up out at the point where you hope the students will be by the end of the year. It's important to make sure that that goal line is escalating throughout the year. We want the students to grow to meet that goal line. So it's not that we start at the baseline and sort of make the goal line even across. We actually, as they're growing, other students are growing as well. And so we want students to sort of continue to rise to meet that goal line. So goal or aim line is one term that we'll be using commonly. Another term that we're going to be using is the trend or rate of improvement. So as I mentioned before, because we have some of these highs and lows in the data, sometimes we need something to sort of stabilize the data. So we take those data points and we sort of collapse them on a line of best fit. And that's our trend line or our rate of improvement. Here you can see the rate of improvement for this data that was collected right here. It helps to sort of visualize where this data is leading or what this data is telling us overall. Finally, another term that we'll be using is adaptation or instructional change. And we typically indicate that with a vertical line on our graph to indicate that a change was made. So here you can see some data was collected by the teacher. Here's our progress monitoring data. And then that teacher chose to implement some type of instructional adaptation, and that's indicated with this vertical line. You might remember, just a little while ago, we looked at that graph that had 4 different intervention changes, and each of those were separated with that vertical line to indicate sort of a change in instruction. As the teacher continues to graph this data, he or she might continue to draw those vertical lines to separate one phase of intervention from the next. So in this way, we're sort of capturing those changes, and we can look within a phase of instruction to see how that compares to the next phase. Something you might want to think about as you share this data with others, as much as these terms might be familiar or a bit unfamiliar to you, they might also be a bit unfamiliar to others that you're sharing this graph with. And so you might want to describe what these things mean to parents, to other teachers you're working with, just so they're also able to interpret the graph. So just something to think about and point out. I know when I work with parents of my students, I tried to kind of give them like a Graph 101 sort of overview in a real simplistic way, even sort of like providing colored lines to say, this is what we're shooting for, the blue line, this is where your child is, the green line, you know, so providing that in a pretty straightforward way. So let's talk a little bit about what those decision rules might look like, and in particular, we're going to talk about how to look at your data and think through issues with level, trend, and variability as you get ready to make decisions about what to do next with your student. So we're really using visual analysis to look at level, trend, and variability. And let's look first at level and think about how that applies to using our graph data to make decisions. So when we're looking at level, we compare students' data points to the goal line, and we ask ourselves, are most points above the goal line? In which case, awesome, let's increase the goal. Are most points below the goal line? We would make a change. Are most points near the goal line? Keep as is. This, of course, is probably not quite as scientific as actually calculating a trend line, but sometimes we don't have, you know, the trend line calculated, and we walk in to a problem-solving team meeting and we have our graph data and we need to make a decision with the data that we have. And so level can be a way that we can sort of visually examine and make a decision. It's important to remember that we're thinking about consecutive data points above or below the goal line. Many researchers recommend adapting instruction if there are 4 consecutive data points below the goal line, increasing the goal if there are 4 consecutive data points above the goal line. We suggest you collect at least 8 data points before you make a decision. Even though it's going to take a while to collect that data, it's really important that we give an intervention a chance to work. And in the academic areas, it takes longer for us to see the effects of those interventions. So we recommend 8 data points before you make that first decision. If you make an intervention change, keeping that change in place at least 6 more data points before you make the decision again. And it's important to continue to look at also our next 2 things, variability and trend, as you examine that level. So one way you can visually analyze the data, level. Here's some examples of how to look at level. So in this case, as we examine most of the data points, let's go back and think about what our decisions might be. Are most points above the goal line, below the goal line, or near the goal line? Okay, so let's look at this graph again. Okay, look at those data points. And what would be your decision? Good. Keep as is. Most points are on or near the goal line, so we would likely keep instruction as is. Here's another example. Look at those data points again. Okay. And in this case, what would our decision be? Change or adapt an instruction. In this case, most of our data points are below the goal line, so in this case, it's likely time for an instructional change. You can see here that those purple data points, there are 8 data points. That's the number of data points we need before we make a decision. Each time we're thinking about, do we have enough data to make that decision? And in this case, we did, and our decision would be to change or adapt instruction. You might remember before that I talked about your next step then would be to indicate that change. You draw vertical line to separate this data from the data that you're now going to collect in that new instruction or intervention. All right, let's look at another example. In this next example, we're going to look actually now at trend. So a trend is another way to visually examine the data. In the case of trend, you're comparing the student's rate of growth, or the trend line, against the aim or goal line. You're again asking yourself these questions. One, is the trend above or steeper than the aim line, in which case we would raise the goal? Is the trend the same as or even with the aim line? Keep as is. Is the trend below or flatter than the aim line? We would need to change instruction. So we've got this three-step process again that we're using to make decisions, but this time we're not basing it on looking at the individual data points. This time we're basing it on looking at the trend of the data. Remember, trend is like the line of best fit. Trend is our line of slope, okay? So you're gonna calculate that trend line and compare that to your goal or aim line, okay? So let's look at an example. So here's our example one again. Remember how we visually examined and we had these data points. They were at or near the goal line. In this example, we actually mapped in a trend line. So in this example, the trend is slightly above the goal line, but it's pretty close, right? So here's trend, here's goal, like the space between those is pretty close. So it could be that our decision could be to raise the goal, but because they're so close, we'd suggest keeping everything as is, okay? You can adjust the goal later if the student continues to outperform their goal, but the important takeaway is that your instruction appears to be successful, you're on track, and later we may even need to heighten the goal for the student. So here's another example with trend line. We're back to that second example where we had the data points below the goal line when we visually examined level. In this case, the trend line clearly holds up that decision to change or adapt instruction. The trend line is clearly not on track to meet the goal line. And in fact, as we look at the data points and think about level, it could be, if we use this 4 consecutive data points below the goal line, that we could have even suggested making a change even more quickly. So if we go back here and think about 1, 2, 3, 4 data points below the goal line, it could be that at this point we even decided to make that decision to a change or adapt instruction. So we've talked a little bit about visual examination using level, using trend. Let's talk a little bit about variability of data or bounce in the data. Variability in CBM happens. Variability is common. Students have days when they certainly are reading more fluently or less fluently, or they're providing more, correct choices on a maze than the next day. But variability is the amount of bounce between data points around the goal line. So we want to look at that variability and ask ourselves, is there a lot of variability between scores, or are the scores relatively stable? This will help us make better decisions about our data. You can see up here, this is pretty unstable data. There's really extreme highs and lows in that data. So we want to think about how we can look at and make sense of that data. So here we are again. This is our example that we've looked at a couple of times. We have our trend line mapped into this data. But now, when we look at this data, we have those data points that hover around the goal line. But now down here, we have this extreme score. Again, not that surprising. This is pretty common in CBM data, but we have to think about what this might do, how this might affect the data as we look at it. In this case, if you remember the trend, where the trend was before for this example, the trend was in our other example, it was actually sort of right on the goal line, just, if you remember, just slightly above the goal line. Now, this extreme score has actually pulled our trend down. In the case where we were looking at just these data points, it actually was suggesting that we would stay as is, or that at some point in the future, near future, we might actually raise the goal. Now our trend line is actually pulled down below the goal line because of this extreme score. So one of the things you might consider is to actually remove the extreme score, and then the trend line would be back sort of equal to the goal line. This score is so different from the rest of these scores that it constitutes sort of what we would consider an extreme score. So as I mentioned, drop the score and then reevaluate and consider keeping as is based on that initial trend that we calculated. Let's look at another example. So here's our second example that we've looked at a couple of times. So in this case, this extreme score this is sort of a tricky example. The level might suggest, the level of these data points upon visual examination might suggest to keep as is. But the data points are generally falling below the goal line, and so we might actually suggest that a change should be made. The 4-point rule might suggest we should make a change even earlier. However, the trend line is actually trending above the goal line, and largely due to this extreme score now. So this score, even though it's just a single score among many, this score is really now sort of pulling up that trend line and gives you sort of an inaccurate representation of what that data is telling you. We could remove the extreme score, and then both level and trend would suggest a change. However, this extreme score is the last data point collected, and so instead we might collect 2 to 3 more data points to determine if that score was just random or if that's actually a pattern. So there's some different ways to think about this data, but if that extreme score is actually the last data point, you can kind of see up here, it's the final data point that we've collected in this data series. We might actually collect a couple of more data points before we make a decision, just to see if this is perhaps a trend of a new and exciting, level above the goal line. So, in summary, your decisions: raise the goal, keep as is, adapt or change instruction. How are you going to do that? You're going to look at level, trend, variability. So just some pieces, but I think if you can kind of keep those 3 things in mind: raise the goal, keep as is, adapt instruction. Sometimes I kind of think of it as raise the goal, keep as is, thumbs down, it's not great, data isn't going as great as we hope, adapt instruction. What are we going to look at? Level, trend, variability. General guidelines, again, 8 data points for that first decision, and then 6 data points for any subsequent decision. If you do decide to keep as is, you might reevaluate every 2 to 4 weeks. You might even reevaluate every week just to make sure that the data continues to show you that you should keep that instruction as is. We don't want to wait too long if we've kept it as is and then find out we should have made a change. So 8 data points for the first decision, and then if you're going to make an instructional change, 6 data points after that. But if you decide to keep as is for that first decision, continue to reevaluate often. 2 to 4 weeks would be the maximum. Okay, so let's look at some examples, and you're actually going to take a look at these and identify some of these variables. Here's an example of graphed data. We have, again, we have our baseline data or initial phase data. We've got a little trend line mapped in here. We've got phase 1 data. Here it is. There's lots of different scores in the red. We've got our trend line right here. And then we have our goal line all the way across, so you can see our goal line. So what I want you to do is look at this graph. You can talk to someone next to you, but I want you to identify the level, the trend, the variability, and what your decision would be at this point, okay? It's time for a phase change. What would your decision be? Remember, you have 3 choices for decisions: raise the goal, keep as is, or make an adaptation to instruction, okay? So look at this graph, identify level, trend, variability, and your decision. Okay, go ahead and do that now. So you've had a minute to look at this graph. Let's talk about the level, trend, variability. So in this one, as you eyeball the data, the level, this one's kind of tricky because there are some data points, you know, it looks like about 5 of the data points are above the goal line. There are 3 data points that are below the goal line. So, you know, in this case, the majority of the data points are above the goal line, but we might have to know more. It might be hard to make the decision just from level. As we look at the trend, our data becomes more clear. The trend compared to the goal line, the trend is below, but it's pretty close. However, when we think about variability, there's one considerable outlier, so you know which one it is, right? It's this one right down here. And so we might think about, you know, like if I remove that data point, then what does the trend of the rest of my data look like? Of course, you know, it would sort of likely raise that trend. So if I remove that outlier, what is the rest of my data telling me? So I want to think about that. So in this case, my decision might be to stay as is. The trend line is pretty close to that goal line. Even if I remove the outlier, the trend is going to move up a little bit, and it might be that the trend is a little above the goal line. But I do have these points, these 3 points below the goal line. As a teacher, that's a little worrisome, so I might be a little reticent to make a change right now. I might want to go ahead and keep instruction as is. Let's look at a second example. Again, we have initial data. We have that trend line mapped in to that data. We have a second series of data, and then we have the trend line mapped into that data. Here's our goal line over here. Okay, so right here, that's our goal line up there. Identify the following: level, trend, variability, and right at this point, okay, remember where we see the split, what would be your decision next? So identify level, trend, variability, and what would be your decision next? Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at level of the data. This example is a little bit more straightforward. So all of the data points for this one are below the goal line. As I look at it visually, the level, all the data points are below. So my decision, if I was just looking at level, would be to make a change in instruction. When I look at trend, make a change in instruction. That trend line is below the goal line. When I look at variability, what did you think about variability? This one actually isn't very variable. It's pretty consistent, actually. There aren't a lot of extreme scores. So in this case, I wouldn't remove any scores. So my decision would likely be make a change or adapt instruction. All right. Oh, now here, this is what we're talking about, right? Let's look at this example. Again, we've got some pretty wild data here. We're going to identify level, trend, variability, and then what your decision would be. Look at that data, talk with someone next to you, talk to your group, and then in a minute we'll come back together and let's talk about what we think about this data. Okay, so this one is a tough one. Even the baseline data, you can see here, was pretty variable, like scores really pretty different. So here's our goal line here, okay, up there. Here's our trend line. First, let's look visually at the level of the data. So most data, even though it's really variable, most data is above the goal line. So if I was going to make a decision based just on level, I would probably suggest to raise the goal because the level is above, most data, the level visually is above the goal. Trend would uphold that decision to raise the goal. The trend is clearly above the goal line. However, variability is definitely of concern. What scores did you think were extreme scores? I would say, you know, at least these two, those are pretty extreme. You might suggest this one. This one is fairly close to the baseline data and to the goal line, so maybe not so extreme. In some cases, we might have even suggested in the past that this one is extreme. And so there are a few scores that we might have to eliminate. So just a couple of things to keep in mind as you apply these, what we're calling decision rules, to your data. They're really guidelines, so they're not meant to be inflexible. They're meant to guide your thinking, promote timely and appropriate changes to instruction. We don't want you to ignore the rules and keep the instruction despite the data trend, but do keep in mind, like, sometimes you might have 9 data points before you make a decision. These aren't meant to be sort of hard and fast, like we never make any changes in these rules. The most important thing is that you're being responsive to the data. Sometimes we just stick with things too long that aren't good for students, and we stick with them because we think like, oh, that's worked in the past, or that's, you know, worked for a lot of students. We want to really be responsive to that data. Another thing to keep in mind is to not lower the goal. It would be a very rare circumstance that you would lower the goal. So if the data is below the goal line, it's likely because instruction is not working for students. So rather than lower the goal, we want to think about those instructional changes or adaptations.